One of the things that really hurt Apple was after I left, John Sculley got a very serious disease. It's the disease of thinking that a really great idea is 90% of the work. And that if you just tell all these other people, here's this great idea, then of course they can go off and make it happen. The problem with that is that there's just a tremendous amount of craftsmanship in between a great idea and a great product. And as you evolve that great idea, it changes and grows. It never comes out like it starts, because you learn a lot more as you get into the subtleties of it. And you also find it's that process that is the magic.
Is the iPhone 5 the last true iPhone? I can already see the comments on this video now. What do you mean? Every iPhone is an iPhone. What else could they be? And yeah, literally speaking, every iPhone is a true iPhone. The only non-true iPhones, I suppose, would be those so-called iPhones you find for 20 bucks on wish.com. But there's been a definite shift in how newer iPhones are marketed and designed from the precedent Steve Jobs set in the early days. From the redesign of iOS 7 to some of the more questionable choices and changes like the headphone jack removal, Bendgate, the overpriced iPhone 5C, and the abhorrently buggy iOS 11. Not to say there weren't mistakes in Steve Jobs' time, because there absolutely were, and Antennagate with the iPhone 4 is a good example. But there's no question Apple is not the same company it once was, and whether that's a good or bad thing or somewhere in between is really in the eye of the beholder. So I even ask the question of whether or not the iPhone 5 is the last true iPhone, and why is the 5 specifically the phone I'm choosing? First off, why am I specifically marking the division between the Jobs era and the Tim Cook era with the iPhone 5? I'm sure some of you can guess already, but I'll quickly explain myself before really jumping too deep into the iPhone blabber. Steve Jobs passed away the October of 2011, shortly after the iPhone 4S was unveiled, and a full year before the iPhone 5 would launch. But Apple doesn't release an iPhone without plans for the next one already in place. Each iPhone is typically in development for probably around 2 years before launch, and quite possibly even longer. I wouldn't be surprised if Apple has at least their next 5 years more or less roadmapped out. Steve Jobs likely had at least a bit of input on the iPhone 5S as well, but as far as we know, the iPhone 5 was the last phone he would work closely on in terms of the design process. I've read before that Jobs likely had some say on the iPhone 5C, however, I kinda think this is unlikely given a few factors that we'll get to in a bit. So Jobs worked intimately with the iPhone 5, and what really cements the feeling of his legacy is the final iteration of iOS featuring skeuomorphism, a design theme that incorporates realistic looking app icons and designs throughout the operating system of iOS 6. It's certainly a nostalgic experience, and one that does feel very out of place in modern times. And since the redesign in 2013 with iOS 7, we've never had a change on the same level, but instead incremental differences every update. So while iOS 15 has many changes from iOS 7, it still doesn't look that far out of place, especially compared to how it looks beside the iPhone 5 still running iOS 6. The iPhone 5 design also really fit what Jobs had publicly said he considered to be the best way of designing a smartphone. It was a size comfortable to hold and use with one hand, and was the perfect evolution of the former 3.5-inch display, as it kept the same width but simply made the phone taller, which increased the aspect ratio to the familiar 16:9 from the older 3:2. And this 4-inch iPhone 5's design still lives on today in a number of ways. The 2016 iPhone SE still has iOS support even on iOS 15, and beyond just that, recent iPhones have attempted to recapture the magic of the look and feel with the flat edges on the iPhone 12 and the 12 Pro. I love the look of this. The aluminum sides on my 12 here really just feel like the iPhone 5 does, and it can even stand up on its own like the older phone, something I really appreciate as someone who spends way too much time pointing a camera at smartphones. One point I'd like to suggest is that Apple actually hasn't made a strong iPhone design since Steve Jobs had any input. Now this will likely be a bit of a controversial statement, especially with some of the most gorgeous smartphones we've ever seen coming in recent years with the iPhone 10, 11 Pro and its frosted glass, and the return to the flat edge design with the 12 and 12 Pro. But what do all these phones more or less have in common? They harken harken back to an iPhone that was designed under the guidance of Jobs. The iPhone X brought glass and stainless steel back from the iPhone 4 days, the 11 Pro kept that but made the glass frosted, and the 12 went to the flat edges that are near identical to the iPhone 5 while keeping the glass back. I think it's fair to say that the frosted glass introduced with the 11 Pro is a design element completely new to Apple at least, although it's been on Android phones before, and so I do think it is an exaggeration to give all credit for all iPhone designs to Jobs and of course his crew, but there's a reason the iPhone 4 and 5 design have been re-implemented so many times throughout recent history. Before the iPhone 4, I think we can all agree, iPhones were pretty mediocre design-wise in comparison. The first one was aluminum, but it definitely was of the time, and the plastic 3G and 3GS do look really nice in my opinion, but the plastic and overall feel is not as premium as the 4, 4S, or 5. And looking to the reign of Tim Cook, the major redesigns we've seen haven't actually been too plentiful. The iPhone 6 was the first one, and honestly, it's one of my least favorite iPhone designs. Obviously, this is 100% subjective, but the plastic antenna bands going across the back are clearly trying to imitate what the iPhone 5 and 5S did with the glass, and just fully misses the mark in my eyes. You also had that ugly gold color, something that I really didn't mind back in the day, but in hindsight, I really don't feel like fits the look of the phone. Super subjective, and I'm sure some of you are still using a gold aluminum iPhone like the SE, 6S, or even 7. And before we talk about the 7, the iPhone 5C, I'm kind of considering to have a similar design to the iPhone 5. It is its own thing, and I think you can make the argument that it's one of the only iPhones that is completely different from anything Steve Jobs had set forth. However, it's the same general size as the iPhone 5, and it is an iPhone 5 basically in plastic, so I don't mind its design, honestly. It just was way overpriced for what it was, and even if it had been reasonably priced, I don't think the design is anything mind-blowing, but I can see the appeal. The iPhone 7, you might say, had a really nice design, and I actually won't argue that. I think they really improved on what they had made with the iPhone 6, particularly with the matte and jet black colors. But that's the thing, they improved on the iPhone 6 design, and the same goes for the iPhone 8. They weren't anything new, at least not really, and the fact that Apple took so long to get the design right is a bit disappointing. We went from redesigns of the iPhone every 2 years to getting the same overall look for over 3 years until the iPhone 10. Part of this can be easily blamed on the stagnation of the smartphone industry as a whole. As smartphones have progressed and began to catch up to computers and historically more powerful counterparts, we get to this point where it's naturally just going to take longer for improvements to be implemented. And that significant jump forward we used to see nearly every year just isn't feasible anymore. But at the same time, just imagine getting that iPhone 7 design in 2014. I don't think it would have been impossible. Just add back the headphone jack and the physical home button, and the phone totally could have looked like that at that point, and that would have been a huge deal, and a really great iPhone design. Because, at least in my eyes, the iPhone 7's design isn't bad, just sullied by the fact that it's just a better version of the 6. And to be fair here, a lot of people, including myself, really loved the design of the iPhone 6 when it came out, but with the power of 2020 hindsight, or 2021 hindsight if you will, I just can't help but feel it really doesn't hold up. If the iPhone 7's design comes out in 2014, you probably get no bend gate, and then in 2015 you could have the same design again just like the 6S did with the 6, and then in 2016 you make the iPhone 8, releasing wireless charging a year early. You satisfy those who want a new design while still making a real improvement and keeping a tried and true form. And then in 2017 you get the iPhone X's design, bringing us back on track to where we came from to today. So only one phone launch in 2017 instead of both the iPhone 8 and the 10. When the iPhone 4 came out, the design was so far ahead of any of the so-called competition, it was honestly laughable. Look at any 2010 or even 2011 phone compared to the 4. It's not even close, from the Retina display to the gorgeous glass and stainless steel. And it's really no coincidence Android didn't start to catch up in relevance until after Steve Jobs had passed on. Although it probably would have happened anyway, especially if Jobs had stuck to his guns concerning the smaller size of smartphones. And it's not like Android smartphones were selling terribly in the early days, there was just a significant gap in quality from an iPhone to the common Android. But when it comes to those sizes of smartphones, Jobs wanted phones to fit in one hand, and I personally believe this take was pretty reasonable when it was said. But in the early 2010s, as phones began to do more and more, it made sense the display would increase in size, as it would make consuming content a more enjoyable experience, to the point of outright replacing computers and even TV for many of its users. My YouTube channel is mainly watched on mobile according to my analytics, and that's a trend that can be seen basically anywhere across the platform, something that definitely wouldn't be the case if phones were still the size of the iPhone 4. To nail in a further point regarding how there was a substantial shift in future plans from the Jobs era to the Tim Cook and Johnny Ive one, iOS 7, the iPhone 5C on its own was something I highly doubt Jobs ever would have approved of, with his thought process of Apple being a premium brand, but iOS 7 I doubt he would have liked either, at least at the time. Now I do believe under Jobs we would have seen a redesign from the skeuomorphism in some aspect eventually, as the times were changing rapidly and Jobs' tastes would have likely changed as well, especially as he saw other UIs improve around him. And some might even argue Jobs would have been on board for the iOS 7 redesign in the first place, but considering some of the features iOS 6 brought, I don't think, in the very least, he was in any way a part of the planning for it. iOS 6 was a pretty straightforward update made to refine and improve the already solid foundation of iOS 5. iOS 5 had been a pretty significant change from iOS 4, revamping notifications, adding iCloud, iMessage, the camera shortcut on the lock screen, and various other modifications. With iOS 6, it did feel like a lot of new improvements had been put on halt, at least temporarily, as the update focused on stability and didn't add much more than Apple Maps, which wasn't exactly a success from the get-go. The YouTube app was also gone from iOS 6, as Google opted to make their own app accessible only from the App Store, which I don't really have any problem with as it wasn't Apple's decision, and I don't think it makes much real difference in the overall experience, besides the latest version of YouTube for iOS 6 being kind of a buggy mess. I would predict that iOS 7 under Steve Jobs would have been another gradual refinement update, perhaps updating the UI of various apps, much like iOS updates nowadays, as they often slowly change design elements here and there instead of all at once. With iOS 6, something that is often forgotten and not even mentioned on the Wikipedia page was the music app overhaul, completely revamping the UI with a beautiful dark design and having your music library organized in a simplistic but stylistic fashion. This to this day is my favorite music app of any Apple has ever put out there, and I believe iOS would have continued leaning into this darker theme as opposed to the gray and blue of earlier versions. Yeah, the list for your music is still white, but I do really like this 3D, darker, embedded look and feel for the buttons, and that volume slider especially is awesome. The App Store and iTunes Store also got revamped with black on the top and bottom as opposed to the blue, and then these sideways scrollable segments were new, with the album art and app icons popping off the page with the 3D shadowing. This is really nicely designed, and I don't see why they would have bothered with any of this if they hadn't originally at least planned to move forward with this design in future iOS versions. iOS 6 never added much for functionality over iOS 5, and I'm guessing that's because iOS 7 was coming and they wanted to save features for that. But they still made these redesigns in the music app, App Store, iTunes Store. They didn't need to do that, and I doubt they would have bothered changing it for the sake of change when it was going to be replaced a year later anyways. So these were likely planned, and I don't want to get too off topic here, so I'll try to refocus a bit. My point in all this is that Steve Jobs still being around would have made a massive difference in the future of Apple, not just with iPhones, but with iOS as well, as we probably would have got that skeuomorphic look for at least a couple more years. When it comes to Apple today, I really do think they have things pretty well figured out at this point, but there's no question they struggled at first with the iPhone 5C and the bend-gate-prone iPhone 6 being unfortunate missteps in the long run. To answer the question, was the iPhone 5 the last true iPhone? No, it wasn't. I think there are arguments for a fair few iPhones since then, namely the iPhone 5S and the iPhone 10 in particular. And I believe the definition of what makes up a true iPhone has shifted over the years, as Apple has found their own path beyond what Steve Jobs had set out, and the Apple of today is different from the Apple of a decade ago, but that doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. I really like how the iPhone lineup looks right now, with a huge variety of devices at different price points, so there's a fit for nearly anyone looking to upgrade to something better than what they already have, and the amount of support iOS devices are getting nowadays are absolutely ridiculous. To call the latest and greatest iPhones untrue in accordance to Steve Jobs' original vision is unfair, simply because, like all things, that vision would have changed as time progressed. After all, the Macs of 2011 were significantly different from the Macs of 2001, and Jobs was actively approving of all the changes being made. While the right to repair and accessibility has been done away with since his passing, something he might not have been on board with, extended software support and the variety in their lines of products has greatly been expanded. The M1 chipset is an absolute miracle of a CPU, completely blowing away what Intel has has been capable of as they struggle to improve their CPUs from what they've been making for years now. What a true iPhone is in today's context no longer adheres to Jobs' original vision, not only because he isn't around anymore, but also because we have no way of really knowing what his expectations would be like if he were still alive today. And I'm of the opinion that while we can easily judge some of Apple's earlier decisions post the Jobs era, since around that iPhone 10 they've actually been pretty solid and on a good track. A slow one to be sure when it comes to newer innovations and changes in the design and feature set, but a steady one all the same. And again, that variety in iPhones with the 10R, 11, the 12 mini, the SE, and it all started with that iPhone 5C, which was a complete failure and something probably Jobs wouldn't have allowed, but it got Apple's toes wet, so to speak, and from there they were able to start looking at making those budget-oriented phones. More choice is a good thing, and under Jobs you never had much choice, not that he really had a chance to change that. But most of the early iPhones after his passing, in particular with the iPhone 5C, the iPhone 6, the iPhone 7 and its headphone jack, or lack thereof, I believe all those phones can be judged pretty harshly. The 5S was a great device, in large part because it was so closely attached to the iPhone 5 design, while simply changing the internals to the first 64-bit chipset in a smartphone and Touch ID, making it one of, if not the greatest iPhone ever made. The 5C was overpriced, plastic, and certainly not something Jobs would have done. The iPhone 6 was made with a cheap aluminum, and while there had been hardware failures in the past with the iPhone 4's antenna gate, I feel like the whole bending fiasco would have been harder to overlook in quality control, but Apple pushed it out anyway. The 6S was a really solid phone, but one that should have been the iPhone 6 in the first place, as it essentially just managed to fix everything wrong with its predecessor. The iPhone SE was a great budget addition to the lineup, and one that of course again adheres to the iPhone 5 design. The iPhone 7 might look nicer than the 6S, but the removal of the headphone jack was hugely anti-consumer and a decision that just didn't need to be made. Apple under Jobs had gotten rid of popular ports. When Jobs got rid of those ports, it's because he was confident they wouldn't be a part of the future, and he was right. Getting rid of the headphone jack is still widely used today, and it's been widely used forever, but hey, Apple had to sell those AirPods, I guess. The iPhone 8 and 8 Plus were pretty straightforward upgrades to the 7, so I have no qualm with them, and that iPhone 10 was a finally new, modern, and innovative iPhone design that Apple had been sorely lacking since the early 2010s, and there's a reason they've continued using more or less the same design with minor changes since then, and probably will continue to do so. The iPhone 10 was really well designed, and I think since then, Apple's done a really great job at doing their fairly incremental but decent sized updates. I'm not a huge fan of every phone since. The 10S was pretty lackluster, for example, but I do believe the Tim Cook era of Apple has finally found its way within the last half decade, and I'm both curious and excited to see what comes next for the company that changed the world again and again over the past 50 years. Apple's not what it once was, and it never will return to the form it established under Steve Jobs as much as a lot of us would like it to. But that doesn't mean we can't appreciate its newer products for what they are, and I think calling the newest iPhones not true is disingenuous, as it's easy to complain and reminisce on the so-called good old days, but we're not in those good old days anymore. I miss Steve Jobs, his influence, his impact, but Apple has moved on, and so should we. We should never stop remembering Jobs, but the constant comparisons to what he would have done with every new Apple product releases does get a tad redundant. We have no way of knowing what he would do, but in the very least, hopefully now we have a bit of an answer to whether or not the iPhone 5 was the last true iPhone. By definition of Jobs needing to have a say on the device, yeah, it was. The iPhone 5 was the last true iPhone, but I believe there has been a good number of iPhones since that have exemplified his values and been truly innovative, particularly with an iPhone 5S and iPhone 10. Was the iPhone 5 the last true iPhone? No, and I don't think we've seen the best of Tim Cook's Apple quite yet, although I guess we'll have to see what happens in the future. Was there a point in asking this question? Maybe not. I just find it kind of interesting to talk about how Steve Jobs would have viewed the company today and kind of how Apple so quickly changed. There's just such a distinctive shift from 2012 to 2013 with that iOS 6 and iPhone 5 to iOS 7 and the 5C especially. I just find it all very interesting and wanted to talk about it, so hopefully you enjoyed. I think I'm right about done here. What do you think Jobs would say about the tech landscape today? We might not know what he would say, but we can certainly speculate. Make sure you let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech if you'd like to for some reason, and we do have a Discord linked in the description. Make sure you drop by and say hi. Might be doing some more videos videos on Steve Jobs as we approach the 10-year anniversary of his passing. We'll see what happens. With that all being said, I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.